Welcome back. We're continuing our review of study types with the next most common study type in the medical literature, something called the cohort study. Our goals today are to explain the concept of the cohort study, which is the most common design in the medical literature, show you what cohort studies are good for and their major limitations, and give some rules of thumb regarding how to interpret cohort studies. To start, I want you to imagine cohort studies, though, as a really, really challenging marathon. The ultimate marathon is a competition unlike any other. 10,000 individuals start, but how many will actually cross the finish line? Along the way, they'll face grueling uphill slopes and long, shin-battering plains. They'll dodge poisonous spikes and tiny kittens who look cute at first, but when you get closer, it turns out that they are ferocious hell kittens. There are cliffs of fire and giant sinkholes around every corner. There's a solid mile that is covered in loose Legos. Oh, come on! And no one is allowed to wear shoes. The ultimate marathon is quite a show. There are a million ways to lose, but only one way to win. Now, a cohort study is very much like this marathon. Why is that? Well, because we start with a very specific group of people, right? We start with people who signed up for the marathon, or we start with people who entered the marathon. They are the people at the starting line, and we follow them forward in some time to some ultimate outcome. What happens to them? Do they make it to the finish line of the marathon? Do they fall into the cliffs of fire? All these different outcomes can happen to them, but we're starting with an exposure and we're letting the outcomes come. That is the essence of a cohort study, and we'll talk now a little bit about how it's going to work in the medical world. Everything is always tied to exposures and outcome. Remember, exposures is something about the patient or that we do to the patient, and outcome is what happens to them. In a cohort study, we start with a broad population of people. We sample from that population, right? We're going to take a group from the population of, let's say, men who are between the ages of 40 and 60. We take a sample of that population and we measure an exposure. The exposure can be anything, whether they smoke or not, what their cholesterol level is, whether they're married, what their income is. But we measure the exposure in that population, and then we see what their outcome is. Some of the people in this population will develop lung cancer. Some of them won't. Some of them will win the lottery. Some of them won't. And we look at the relationship between those exposures and the outcome. The exposure is one of those characteristics present at the start of the race, okay? It's there at baseline. That's important in the design of a cohort study. And the finish line is the outcome. Most outcomes in a cohort study are bad. Most medical cohort studies look at bad things that can happen to you, like death and stuff like that, but they don't have to be. There are studies that look at quitting smoking or staying quit from smoking as an outcome. That's objectively a good thing, right? But most of them do tend to be bad. Now, let's talk a little bit about the timing of a cohort study, because you'll see them described as retrospective and prospective cohort studies, and this is just a little bit of jargon, but you should kind of know the difference, and I'll take us back to our race analogy. A prospective cohort study means we collect data along the way. We are literally at the race side as the race is being run, and we are writing down every mile or so, what's happening to these people and whether they fell off the cliffs of fire and whatnot, right? So we are there. In a prospective cohort study, we are following the patients. We don't know what's going to happen to them. We're following them for years and years potentially, and measuring the things we choose to measure. And that's really powerful, right? Because we can measure novel things that don't get collected routinely. Weird levels of protein in the blood or something. We can bring them in for a blood draw. That's a prospective cohort study, generally thought as a more powerful design because of your ability to measure those additional things that might not be captured. Now, a retrospective cohort study is the same. It's the same race, but imagine that you're looking at a film of the race or a video of the race. You can rewind, you can fast forward, you still see who started and who finished, but you can't collect anything along the way. It already happened. You aren't there. You can't draw blood on the people halfway through the race. The race was run a year ago, okay? So you can get the same raw information, but you're much more limited into the other things you can collect along the way. Prospective cohort studies, much more expensive, right? You're enrolling these patients, you're bringing them into the office and things like that. A retrospective cohort study you can do from existing data, makes it cheaper, not as powerful, but maybe a good way to sort of start a new line of research. The analysis is exactly the same, but a prospective cohort allows you to collect specific, perhaps novel data that a retrospective cohort does not. So let's look at a cohort study that announced itself. There's this article, which appeared in the journal Stroke. It's entitled Alcohol Consumption at Midlife and Risk of Stroke During 43 Years of Follow-Up, Cohort and Twin Analyses. So we hear that cohort, we know it's a cohort study, but why? What's the exposure? Well, the exposure is alcohol consumption at midlife. The start of the race here is midlife, presumably. And the outcome? Well, the outcome is stroke over the course of the next 43 years. That's the race being run. So this was 11,000 people in the Swedish Twin Registry. And what they found was that heavy drinkers had greater risk of stroke in later life. And there's the little p-value there of 0.02, denoting that it is below our statistical significance threshold of 0.05. So we would call this a sort of positive study. We think there is a relationship here. You can see it in this graph, the relationship between your risk of stroke and how much you drink among men and women. You can see the shape of the graph sort of suggests that the risk is pretty stable until you start drinking, maybe more than 20 to 40 grams of alcohol per day. Then the risk starts going up. To translate that, a typical drink is like 15 grams of alcohol. So, 2 to 3 drinks a day, maybe your risk of stroke starts going up according to this study. Was this a randomized trial? No, it wasn't. They were not forcing these people to drink. Third factors that are linked both to alcohol consumption and stroke could certainly be at play here. There is something special about a cohort study that it bears mentioning, which is that a lot of times you cannot do a randomized trial, either because it's unethical or it's just impossible. So here's a cohort study that looked at around 70,000 people who were exposed to the 9/11 Trade Center disaster. So they were in the location, they were presumably inhaling dust and smoke and particles. These people were identified, so the exposure was being in the southern part of Manhattan on 9/11, 2001, and they looked at a variety of outcomes. There's two real strengths of this cohort design in this study. Number one, you can't randomize people to being present at 9/11 or not, right? No one's signing up for that study, and you don't know that it's happening beforehand. So there's no possibility of a randomized trial here. Number two, they were able to look at multiple outcomes. So the start of the race was the same, but remember, you can fall off the cliffs of fire, you can get attacked by the hell kittens. They found that there was an increased risk of suicide, brain tumors, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Multiple different outcomes tied to the same exposure. Can we conclude that this is causative, that the World Trade Center disaster caused this? No, we can't. It was not a randomized trial. Maybe people who are predisposed to getting brain tumors like to work in downtown Manhattan or something like that. That's all possible. But there's no other way to do a study like this. Sometimes a cohort study is the best that you can do. What are the limitations of a cohort study? Well, the big one, right? They are not randomized. We don't know if imbalance in either measured factors or, importantly, unmeasured factors is actually dictating the results. Defining the cohort is really tricky. Like, who are you enrolling into this study? Are you just enrolling men who are between 40 and 60 years of old? Are you enrolling men between 40 and 60 years old who have a history of prostate cancer, or who have a history of prostate cancer and are smokers, right? So who gets to the starting line of the race really defines how you're going to interpret the study at the end. Loss to follow-up, just like in randomized trials, right? We might not know. We might start with 10,000 people in our race and get to the end and add everything up and be like, gosh, there's 100 people. We don't know what happened to them. They didn't fall off the cliffs of fire. They didn't get attacked by the hell kittens. We have no idea where they are. What do we do with that people? So you want to see who are lost to follow-up. If the outcome is very rare, right? If the outcome only occurs in 1 out of 10,000 people, well, then you'd need to enroll hundreds of thousands of people to find enough outcomes to make any inferences. And it's really hard to enroll hundreds of thousands of people in a study. There's a solution to this, though. It's called the case control study, and we'll be talking about it next. But here are your take-home points. Cohort studies are a common and useful study design, but they lack the rigor of a randomized trial. Third factors, known as confounders, which we'll talk more about later, are often present. And if medical research was a movie, cohort studies would be the supporting cast. They are not the leading man that the randomized trial is. The cohort study is that, that character actor that brings, a lot of sort of love and heart to the movie that is really necessary for it to win the Oscar, but maybe they don't get quite as much attention as they deserve. I'll catch you next time.